The silence at table 12 should have been just another backdrop to Hajara's shift. Another heavy, expensive layer of air in a room filled with men who treated her like part of the furniture. But when Han Musuk's hand tightened on the edge of the mahogany table, and the translator's voice cracked in a desperate, clumsy lie, something sharp and instinctive flared in Hajara's chest. She had seen men like the one sitting across from Musuk before. Men whose smiles didn't reach their eyes, men waiting for a reason to draw blood. That is not what he said. Hajara's voice cut through the tension, the Korean syllables falling from her lips with a melodic, ancient precision that didn't belong to a waitress in Midtown Manhattan. The entire room froze. The younger associate reached for his jacket. The woman beside Musuk gasped, but the Mafia boss himself slowly turned his head. His eyes, cold enough to stop a heart, fixed on Hajara's calm, dark face. For the first time in his long reign over the underworld, Han Musuk felt a jolt of genuine shock. "Repeat that," he commanded in his native tongue. His voice a low, deadly vibration. Hajara didn't blink. She didn't shrink. She simply adjusted her red waist apron and stepped into the light. "He is insulting your ancestors," while his hand moves toward his piece, Chairman. "If you wait for the translator to find the right words, you'll be dead before the main course." In that moment, the world shifted, and the invisible woman became the only thing Musuk could see. Hajara had served the shadow elite at the Gilded Lily for 3 years without ever disturbing the air. To the titans of industry and the kings of the docks, she was a blur of cream-colored fabric and a bright red bow tie. She knew the rules of the house. Eyes down, steps light, ears closed. Invisibility was Hajara's armor. 26 years of navigating a world that preferred her silence had taught her how to read a room like a map. She knew which men were dangerous by the way they held their silverware, and she knew which ones were weak by how they spoke to the help. Han Musuk was the most dangerous of them all. For months, she had watched him from the periphery, the scent of sandalwood and old power that followed him, the way he occupied space without ever raising his voice. He paid the highest tabs, demanded the most privacy, and expected total silence. Tonight that silence was a death sentence. Hajara had seen the bruise on the translator's neck, the mark of a man who had already been bought. She knew that if she stayed invisible, people would die. Her brother needed his tuition paid. Her mother's shop was 3 months behind on the lease. If she caused a scene, she'd be fired before the appetizers were cleared. But as she looked into Musuk's startled silver-haired gaze, she realized that some things were more important than staying hidden. She had spent her life being overlooked. It was time to show them that the help had been listening the entire time. The silence that followed Hajara's intervention was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized like the deep ocean. She could feel the gaze of the younger associate, sharp as a blade, and the protective, guarded stare of the woman beside the chairman. But it was Han Musuk's eyes that pinned her to the spot. They were eyes that had seen everything and expected nothing new, yet now they burned with a terrifying, revitalized focus. Hajara didn't retreat. She stood with the practiced poise of a woman who had spent years mastering the art of the peripheral. Her journey to this moment hadn't started in a high-end restaurant, but in a small, cramped apartment in Queens, shared with an elderly South Korean widow named Mrs. Park. While other girls her age were out, Hajara had spent her nights trading English lessons for the intricacies of the Korean language. She had learned not just the words, but the Han, that specific cultural weight of sorrow and resentment that lived in the back of the throat. To Mrs. Park, Hajara was the daughter she'd lost. To Hajara, the language was a secret key to a world that usually locked its doors to women who looked like her. She had chosen the Gilded Lily precisely because it was a place where she could remain a ghost. In a world of billion-dollar handshakes and whispered betrayals, a black waitress was often treated as part of the architecture. She had used that invisibility as a shield, listening to the cadence of power, understanding the shifts in tone that signaled a deal closing or a life ending. She had been the expert in shadows, collecting secrets like stray coins, never intending to spend them, until tonight. The rival negotiator across the table let out a jagged, nervous laugh, his hand twitching toward the breast of his suit. Hajara saw the movement before anyone else, the subtle shift of weight, the predatory gleam. "You listen to a servant," the man sneered in English, his voice trembling with the realization that his trap had been sprung. Musuk didn't look at him. He didn't even acknowledge the insult. His focus remained entirely on Hajara, tracing the unmistakably intentional line of her red bow tie and the calm intelligence in her dark eyes. He saw the way she leaned forward, not in submission, but in a stance of quiet, commanding bravery. "In my world," Musuk said, his voice a low grate of gravel in Korean, "those who see what others miss are the only ones worth listening to." He gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the younger man beside him. Within seconds, the room erupted into a controlled, silent efficiency as the associates moved to neutralize the threat. Through it all, Hajara remained still, her breath even. She had finally disturbed the air, and as Musuk's hand relaxed on the mahogany, she knew the shadows would never hide her again. The aftermath of the confrontation was a masterclass in lethal efficiency. Within minutes, the disruptors had been ushered out into the New York night, and the restaurant staff, spurred by a frantic manager, had reset the table as if blood had never been an inch away from the white linen. But Han Musuk did not return to his meal. He remained seated, his silver hair catching the amber glow of the chandelier, his attention anchored solely on the woman in the red bow tie. "The kitchen is closed for the evening," Musuk said, though it wasn't a question directed at the staff. It was a command. When the room finally emptied of everyone but his most trusted associates and Hajara, he gestured to the chair directly across from him. "Sit." Hajara hesitated for a heartbeat, her fingers brushing the hem of her apron. "I have side work to finish, Chairman." "The side work can wait. My curiosity cannot." His voice was no longer the roar of a mafia boss, but the low, sandpaper rasp of a man who had finally found a puzzle he couldn't solve. "You spoke a dialect of Gyeongsang that even my own translator struggles to mimic. You didn't just learn that from a book, Hajara Okoye. Who are you?" Hajara sat, her posture as intentional as it had been while serving the wine. She realized then that the invisibility she had cherished was gone, burned away by the heat of his gaze. "I am a woman who pays attention, Chairman. In my neighborhood, if you don't listen to the subtext, you don't survive the night." She leaned forward slightly, matching his intensity. "I've served you for 7 months. I know you prefer your tea at 80 degrees, not boiling. I know you only take calls from your daughter on the terrace. And I know that when you rub your left temple, the person speaking to you has exactly 30 seconds to change the subject before you lose interest." A flicker of something, not quite a smile but a deep, resonant respect, crossed Musuk's face. He had spent decades surrounded by sycophants who looked at his shoes and bodyguards who looked at his hands, yet this waitress had been dissecting his soul from across the room. He realized with a jolt that while he had been treating the restaurant as his private sanctuary, she had been the silent architect of his comfort. "You have been an apex predator in a server's uniform," Musuk whispered, the realization shifting the air between them once again. "You haven't just been waiting tables. You've been keeping watch." "I was doing my job," she replied quietly. "And tonight, my job was to make sure the only man in this room worth respecting didn't end up a headline." Musuk looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the brilliance she had tried so hard to tuck away. It wasn't a request anymore. It was an acknowledgement. They were no longer master and servant. They were two observers of the dark, finally standing in the light together. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the Gilded Lily shifted, pulled out of its usual orbit by the gravity of Han Musuk's presence. He no longer arrived at the peak of the dinner rush with a phalanx of grim-faced men. Instead, he began appearing early, sometimes 2 hours before his usual reservation, while the sun was still bleeding gold across the Manhattan skyline and the restaurant was nearly empty. He would take his seat at table 12, not with a ledger or a guest, but with a simple cup of barley tea that Hajara had learned to prepare exactly to his 80-degree preference. To the rest of the staff, he was a predator in repose, a terrifying figure whose early arrival sent the manager into a fit of nervous polishing. But Hajara knew better. She felt his gaze follow her as she moved through the dining room, a constant heavy warmth that made the back of her neck tingle. Musuk found himself counting the hours until her shift began, a realization that unsettled him more than any threat from his rivals. For decades, his life had been a series of strategic moves and calculated silences. Now he was drawn to the way Hajara's smooth, dark skin contrasted with the cream of her uniform, and the way she never seemed to hurry, even when the room was screaming with activity. He watched the subtle intelligence in her eyes as she handled difficult patrons, navigating the egos of the city's elite with the same calm precision she had used to save his life. One rainy Tuesday, when the scent of damp pavement and expensive tobacco lingered in the foyer, he stopped her as she moved to refill his tea. The restaurant was quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the ventilation and the distant clatter of the kitchen. "You are working more doubles this week," he noted, his voice a low vibration that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "Your eyes are tired, Hajara." She paused, the teapot hovering over the porcelain. It was the first time he had used her name without a command attached to it. "The lease on my mother's shop doesn't pay itself, Chairman. Fatigue is a luxury I haven't earned yet." "Then let me earn it for you," he said, his hand moving as if to reach for hers before he checked the impulse. "The shadows are getting longer in my world. My enemies are watching this restaurant because they know I am here. Because they know I am looking at you." Hajara didn't pull away from the danger in his words. Instead, she set the pot down and met his stare. "I've lived in the shadows my whole life, Mr. Han. The only difference now is that I'm not alone in them." The scent of danger, a metallic sharp tang that always preceded a storm, filled the space between them. Musuk realized then that his fascination had turned into something far more volatile. He wasn't just coming here for the tea or the quiet. He was coming here because in a world of ghosts, she was the only thing that felt real. But as the rain lashed against the windows, he knew that by seeing her, he had made her a target. The invisibility that had once been her armor was gone, replaced by the lethal radiance of his attention. The invitation arrived not as a card, but as a sleek black sedan idling at the curb when Hajara's shift ended on a humid Thursday night. The driver, the same silent young man who usually sat across from Musuk, held the door open with a deference that felt alien to her. For years, Hajara had been the one opening doors, pulling out chairs, and disappearing into the wallpaper. Now, as the car glided away from the neon hum of Midtown toward the secluded, iron-gated estates of the north, she felt the familiar weight of her invisibility peeling away, leaving her skin raw and exposed. Musuk's estate was a fortress of glass and dark wood, perched over the water like a watchful predator. When she stepped into the foyer, she wasn't met by a maitre d' or a manager, but by Musuk himself. He had discarded the armored formality of his three-piece suits for a soft black sweater, though the gravity of his presence remained unchanged. "You look different without the red bow tie," he said, his voice echoing softly against the minimalist stone walls. "I feel different," Hajara admitted, smoothing the fabric of the simple hunter green dress she had saved for an occasion she never thought would come. "In the restaurant, I know where I stand. Here, I don't even know which fork to use." Musuk led her to a terrace overlooking the Sound, where a table was set for two. There were no white linens, no frantic waiters, just the low hum of the tide and the scent of salt air. "Tonight, there are no forks to worry about," he said, gesturing to the traditional Korean spread laid out before them, dishes that required intimacy, hands, and shared breath. "And you do not stand anywhere. You sit with me." As the meal progressed, the power dynamic that had defined their lives for 7 months began to dissolve. Musuk didn't ask her to serve the tea. He poured it for her, his movements slow and deliberate. He spoke not of business or betrayals, but of the loneliness of the summit, how the higher he climbed in his organization, the more people stopped looking him in the eye. "They see a chairman," he whispered, watching the way the moonlight caught the intelligent curve of Hajara's profile. "They see a bank account or a threat. You are the only one who saw the man who was tired of the silence." Hajara reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his on the table. For the first time, she wasn't observing him for survival. She was seeing him with the clarity of an equal. "Being a guest is harder than being a waitress," she murmured. There's nowhere to hide when someone is truly looking back at you. Musuk closed the distance, his hand covering hers. His palm was calloused and warm, a stark contrast to the cold world he ruled. In that moment, the shadow elite and the invisible staff ceased to exist. There was only a man and a woman, standing on the edge of a dangerous precipice, finally allowing themselves to be found. The peace of the terrace was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden rigid tension in Musuk's frame. A phone vibrated on the stone table, the low hum sounding like a hornet in the stillness. He didn't have to answer it. The way his jaw tightened told Hajara everything. The man who had been pouring tea with such tenderness vanished, replaced by the ghost she had served for 7 months, the one who moved with the lethal grace of a predator. "Stay inside," he said, his voice dropping into that terrifying, gravelly register. But Hajara had spent a lifetime watching the shadows. She didn't need an invitation to see the threat. From the edge of the terrace, she saw the headlights of 3 SUVs cutting through the mist of the driveway. These weren't the polished vehicles of Musuk's fleet. They moved with a jagged, aggressive rhythm. A man stepped out of the lead car, Park Ji-hoon, a name Hajara had heard whispered in the back corners of the restaurant. He was a relic from Musuk's past, a man who believed that power was only valid if it was soaked in blood. He didn't come to negotiate. He came to reclaim what he believed Musuk had made soft. "You've grown distracted, Chairman." Ji-hoon's voice carried up the stone walls, dripping with a mock formality that made Hajara's skin crawl. "I heard you were spending your nights with the help. I had to see for myself what was worth compromising an empire for." Hajara stood behind the glass door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched Musuk step to the edge of the balcony, his silhouette tall and unyielding against the moonlight. There was no fear in him, only a cold, focused radiation of violence. It was a language she had spent her life trying to ignore, but as she watched the men below draw their weapons, she realized she was no longer an observer. By stepping into his light, she had inherited his darkness. "You came to my home, Ji-hoon," Musuk said, the words falling like lead weights. "That is a mistake you won't live to regret." The air turned electric, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending rain. In the chaos that followed, the shout of orders, the flash of steel, Hajara felt the weight of her choice. She had wanted to be seen, but visibility came with a price. Men like Musuk didn't just live in the world. They fought for every inch of it. She wasn't just a guest anymore, and she wasn't just a waitress. She was the one vulnerability a king couldn't afford to have, and as the first shot echoed across the water, she realized she was now irrevocably involved. The morning after the violence at the estate, the sun rose over a city that felt fundamentally different to Hajara. The rules she had lived by for 26 years, move quietly, eyes down, leave no trace, were now as broken as the glass on Musuk's terrace. For the first time in her life, being invisible was no longer an option. By intervening in a war of kings, she had inadvertently painted a target on her back that no amount of shadow could hide. The safety she had meticulously built vanished in a heartbeat. When she arrived at her mother's shop, she found 2 men in charcoal suits, Musuk's associates, standing guard at the entrance. Their presence was meant to be protective, but to the neighborhood, they were a flashing neon sign of trouble. Before she could even step inside, her phone buzzed with a call from a restricted number. It wasn't Musuk. It was a detective from the precinct. His voice clipped and suspicious, asking why a waitress from the Gilded Lily had been seen fleeing a high-end crime scene in the middle of the night. Hajara felt the walls closing in. She was being hunted by 2 very different monsters. The law, which saw her as a witness to be used, and the Mafia, which saw her as a liability to be erased. Park Ji-hoon's men were already scouring the streets, questioning her neighbors and showing her picture to local vendors. The quiet, dignified life she had carved out for herself and her family was being shredded by the gravity of Musuk's world. She spent the afternoon in the back of the shop, her hands trembling as she tried to tally the month's expenses. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart jumped into her throat. She realized that she had made a terrible mistake in thinking she could handle the weight of Musuk's attention. She had wanted to be seen, But she hadn't realized that once you are visible to a man like him, you are visible to every predator in his orbit. By sunset, the restaurant manager had called to tell her she was indefinitely suspended until the police investigation cleared. The one place where she had felt in control was now barred to her. As she watched the blue and red lights of a patrol car cruise slowly past the window, Hajara understood the true cost of her bravery. She had traded her peace for a seat at a table where the only thing on the menu was survival. The expert in shadows was gone, replaced by a woman who was suddenly, terrifyingly, the center of everyone's search. The black sedan appeared again at midnight, but this time it didn't feel like an invitation to a different world. It felt like a cage. Hajara stood in the doorway of her mother's shop, watching Musuk emerge from the back seat. He looked tired, the sharp lines of his tailored suit slightly rumpled, but his eyes held a desperate, burning clarity. Behind him, the street was unnaturally still, held in place by the silent men who stood on every corner of the block like human chess pieces. "You cannot stay here," Musuk said. His voice a low, urgent rasp that cut through the humid night air. "My men have found Ji-hoon's scouts 2 blocks over. The police are preparing a warrant for your questioning. I have a house in the mountains, secure and staffed. You and your family will be safe there by dawn." He reached out, his hand open, offering her a way out, a rope thrown to a drowning woman. But as Hajara looked at his hand, she didn't see safety. She saw the blood that had paid for that mountain house. She saw the surveillance cameras, the armed guards, and the high walls that would keep her safe by making her a prisoner. "You're trying to save me by pulling me deeper into the water, Musuk," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "If I go with you, I stop being Hajara Okoye. I become a ghost again, just a different kind. I'll be the woman hidden in a basement while men like Ji-hoon burn down everything I love just to get to you. It is the only way to keep you alive." Musuk's voice rose, a rare crack in his iron composure. "The world you knew is gone. You spoke to me, Hajara. You chose to be seen. You cannot go back to the shadows now." "I didn't choose to be seen so I could be owned," she shot back, stepping away from the open car door. "Your protection is a weight I can't carry. Every time you try to shield me, you bring the storm closer to my mother, to my brother, to the life I actually want to live." She looked at the man she had begun to love, realizing that his world was a beautiful, lethal machine that destroyed everything it touched. He was offering her a rope, but it was coiled like a noose. She saw the agony in his expression, the realization that his power, the very thing that made him a king, was the one thing that was driving her away. "If I stay with you," she said, her heart breaking with the honesty of it, "you won't be the one who saves me. You'll be the one who finally destroys me." She turned back into the darkness of the shop, leaving him standing under the flickering streetlight, his hand still extended toward a woman who refused to be saved by the fire. The silence that stretched between them in the cramped back office of the shop was more suffocating than the threat of Park Ji-hoon's men outside. Musuk had dismissed his guards to the perimeter, standing alone amidst the crates of stock and the scent of dried hibiscus. He looked out of place in the humble surroundings, a king in a cellar, yet the usual aura of untouchable power had been replaced by something raw and fraying at the edges. "You're right," he said, his voice barely a whisper, devoid of its usual command. "My world is a machine. It's a fortress I built so I would never have to feel the ground shake beneath my feet. I thought that by making you a part of it, I was giving you the greatest gift I possessed: safety." He took a step toward her, not with the predatory grace of the chairman, but with the heavy, uncertain gait of a man who had lost his way. "But I've spent 40 years being safe, Hajara. I've spent 40 years in a suit of armor so thick that I forgot what it felt like to have a heart that beats for someone else. When you spoke to me that night, when you broke your own rules to save my life, you didn't just see me. You woke me up." Hajara watched him, her hand gripping the edge of a wooden table. She saw the moisture in his eyes, a vulnerability so profound it was more shocking than any act of violence she had witnessed. "I am a man of the shadows," he continued, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out, not to grab her but to offer himself. "And the shadows are lonely. I would rather walk beside you into the light, even if it means I am exposed." I would rather die vulnerable, standing on this street corner by your side, than live another 100 years safe and alone behind those glass walls. It was the ultimate confession of a man whose only currency had been fear. He was offering to strip away the empire, the guards, and the ironclad rules, just to be the man she had seen through the subtext of his tea and his silence. Hajara felt the ice around her own heart begin to thaw. She had been so afraid of being destroyed by his world that she hadn't realized he was willing to let it burn to the ground for her. In the dim light of the shop, the gap between the Mafia boss and the waitress finally closed. She saw the strength in his vulnerability, a courage far greater than the kind used to order executions. She reached out, her fingers finally interlacing with his, acknowledging the dangerous, beautiful truth that they were both finished with hiding. For the first time, the rope wasn't a noose. It was a lifeline held by both ends. 5 years later, the morning sun over the Hudson River didn't signal a day of hiding, but a life of radiant ownership. Hajara sat at the head of a conference table in a glass-walled office that overlooked the very streets where she had once moved like a ghost. She was no longer wearing a cream-colored shirt and a red waist apron. Today, she wore a tailored silk suit the color of midnight, her hair styled in an elegant crown that mirrored her newfound authority. The transition had been a storm of its own making. The collision of worlds had required Musuk to dismantle a legacy of shadows piece by piece, turning his vast resources toward legitimate enterprise and community investment. It had been Hajara's vision that guided the way, founding a culinary academy that provided fair wages and language training for immigrant workers, ensuring that no one else had to survive by being invisible. A soft knock at the door made her look up. Musuk stood there, the silver in his hair more pronounced now, but the deadly tension that once defined his shoulders had been replaced by a quiet, grounded peace. He held 2 cups of tea, the scent of toasted barley filling the room. He didn't wait for her to serve him. He walked across the plush carpet and placed her cup before her, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "The board meeting is in 10 minutes, he said, his voice still a low, melodic vibration that made her heart skip. "Are you ready to show them that the woman they once overlooked now owns the building?" Hajara leaned back, looking at the man who had traded an underworld crown for the right to stand beside her in the light. "I think they've known that since the day I stopped being background noise, Musuk." He smiled, a real, unfiltered expression that reached his eyes. "Sometimes I still find myself counting the hours until you come home. Old habits, I suppose." "You don't have to count anymore," she replied, reaching up to cover his hand with hers. "I'm not disappearing into the wallpaper again." As they stood together, looking out at the city that had once made her feel so small, the resonance of their journey was clear. They had survived the language of violence to find a dialect of their own, one built on respect, shared power, and the rare gift of being known. Hajara Okoye was no longer the expert in shadows. She was the architect of a new reality. In a world that had tried to keep them in separate boxes, they had formed something strong, impossible, and utterly theirs. For the first time in her life, as she looked into the eyes of the man who had seen her before she even saw herself, Hajara felt perfectly, beautifully at home.